Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a story that's all about corporate rewards, raw political power, and a controversy that just won't go away. We're talking about the Australia Post watches scandal and why it's suddenly back in the headlines.
And really, it all kicked off with this one sentence, a direct, public ultimatum right from the Prime Minister of Australia on the floor of Parliament. I mean, can you imagine? That single moment sealed the fate of a pretty celebrated CEO and kicked off this huge national debate. So, the question is, how on earth did we get to this point?
All right, so to really get how one sentence from the Prime Minister could bring down a CEO, we have to meet the person at the center of it all, Christine Holgate.
And you know, Holgate wasn't just some random CEO. We're talking about a seriously celebrated leader. She was named CEO of the Year, was headhunted from all over the world for this job, and even took a pay cut to lead Australia Post. And get this, by 2020, her own board gave her a 95% performance rating. By pretty much any measure, she was a corporate superstar.
And that 95% rating, it wasn't just for show. It was backed up by some incredible results. I mean, this was at a time when postal services everywhere were really struggling, especially with the pandemic starting to hit. But under her leadership, Australia Post's profits shot up by 30% with record revenue. The business was absolutely thriving.
So, with all that success, what was the problem? Well, this whole firestorm, this whole mess, it all came down to one single decision made way back in 2018. 4 executives were given these Cartier watches, worth about 20 grand in total, as a thank you for landing a massive deal. A deal we're going to talk more about in a second. Right, so fast forward 2 years to October 2020, and that old decision about the watches, it suddenly explodes onto the front pages. And the fallout? Wow, it was unbelievably fast and just brutal. Just take a look at this timeline. It's wild. In the morning, the watches get a mention in a pretty standard Senate hearing. By early afternoon, the new Australia Post chair is on the phone to Holgate, telling her the Prime Minister wants her stood down. Then, at 2:38 p.m., a minister tells Parliament she will be stood down. And just 4 minutes later, 4 minutes, the Prime Minister himself stands up in Parliament and says, essentially, she can either stand aside or she can go. The speed of it all was just breathtaking.
But here's the thing. There was, allegedly, a whole lot of critical context missing from that initial political explosion. You know, key facts, like the fact that gifting happened 2 years earlier, that the previous chairman had approved it, and that the reward was actually within company policy, all of that seems to have been left out of the public conversation at the time.
And all of this led to a really fundamental question right at the heart of her departure. The official story was that she chose to stand aside. But did she really?
And this is where we get 2 totally different versions of events. You have the Australia Post chair, who testified in a Senate hearing that, yep, she elected to stand aside. But then you have Holgate's team, who have consistently said, no way. They argue she never agreed to it, not in writing, not verbally, and they claim to have witnesses and a ton of evidence to back that up.
Okay, so let's peel this back a bit further. What was this deal all about anyway? Why were these watches even a thing? To get that, we need to look at the business side of the story, the part that was kind of missing from all those initial headlines.
Yeah, this really shows you the disconnect, doesn't it? On one hand, the public story was all about extravagant luxury watches. It sounds terrible. But on the other hand, you have the business reality. This was a reward for landing a massive $220 million deal, a deal that was basically a financial lifeline for nearly 3,000 small local post offices. 2 very, very different stories.
And get this, on top of all that, when you look at the Australia Post regulations, Holgate was apparently authorized to give out rewards up to $150,000 without even needing board approval. So the $20,000 she awarded, it was just a tiny fraction of what she was technically allowed to give. Okay, so remember, the whole reason she was told to stand aside was so an investigation could happen. So naturally, the big question is, what did that investigation actually find?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. A twist, you could say. When the independent report, which was done by the law firm Maddox, was finished, it was immediately classified, ordered to be kept secret.
But you know how these things go. The details eventually started to leak out. Journalists like Robert Gottliebson at the Australian Business Review got a hold of it and reported that this secret report was an absolute bombshell. Not only did it apparently clear Holgate completely, but it also suggested that the Prime Minister's own statements in Parliament were just plain wrong.
So according to these reports, the investigation's findings were pretty clear. Holgate did nothing wrong. The former chairman had approved it, the board knew about it, she was acting within her authority.
And it even praised her work as CEO. I mean, it was basically a complete and total exoneration.
Okay, so that brings us to today. Why is this old story suddenly back? Well, because years after the fact, Senator Pauline Hanson has dragged the whole thing right back into the national spotlight.
By starting to ask questions again about how Holgate was treated, she's basically reignited this whole debate. And now it's not really just about some watches anymore. It's become this new battleground over political accountability, fairness, and the line between government and the big corporations it owns.
And that really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? This whole affair makes us ask, where do you draw the line between necessary government oversight and straight-up political interference?
Think about it. Was that fast, very public takedown a real act of accountability? Or was it more like political theater, where due process got tossed aside for a really good headline?
When you boil it all down, the Christine Holgate story is really this fascinating and messy case study on where public service, commercial reality, and raw political power all collide. And honestly, the answers to these questions tell us a whole lot about what kind of accountability we expect, and maybe what we're willing to accept from our leaders.